Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, our guest today is a former registered nurse from Tasmania, Australia. She currently is a campaigner for science-based nutrition. She's a proponent of the low carbohydrate diet, along with her husband, orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Gary Fettke, whose name you may have heard before. I don't know what else to say. You're a very busy, busy person. Belinda Fettke, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you so much, Nayiri. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. I'm delighted to have you here. We've got a lot to discuss, and this is a topic. What we're going to discuss today is a topic I haven't covered on my channel before. So I think my audience will be interested in what we're going to discuss today. Okay, so let's start with your husband's story. Now, Gary Fettke was an orthopedic, or is he still working as a...
He has just retired, but yes, he was an orthopedic surgeon for nearly 30 years.
Nearly 30 years. So he was a surgeon, and he eventually got discouraged or disheartened seeing his patients come back for leg amputations. And we're specifically talking about diabetic patients whose diabetes control was obviously so poor that they were losing their legs. He got so discouraged that he decided to do the right thing, as any healthcare professional out there should do. We expect them to do. He gave nutrition-related advice to his patients. He told them, or he started advising them, to avoid processed junk.
Yes.
Nothing wrong here. To avoid eating pasta and pastries and probably breads and processed carbs, basically, and focus on meat and healthy real foods.
Yes.
And he was silenced.
He started out only talking about reducing sugar. That was what he started out at, and that was what he got into so much trouble for.
I don't understand why any healthcare professional would be silenced for that. Now, that's when you came into the picture, because you decided to make his story public and to campaign for transparency, because you didn't know at the time who was silencing him. So
we had no idea.
Tell us the story right from the beginning, especially for those in my audience who haven't heard of Gary's story before.
Okay, well, to go back even further, Gary was diagnosed with cancer in the year 2000. Mm-hmm. And the PET scan, looking back years later, the PET scan, which is when they put glucose into your bloodstream and it goes and it lights up the cancerous tumor, the tumor that's very active, and it lit up like a Christmas tree. So it's lighting up to glucose. But of course, in medicine, you learn about anatomy and physiology and biology and biochemistry. You learn all of those things in the first 2 years, and the rest of your medical career or your medical education is spent medicating and band-aiding and operating on sick care. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to go back and see those things in perspective when the rest of your education is just so intent on using pharmaceutical goods and using surgery to fix things, or to band-aid, as I often call it. Mm-hmm. So he didn't even consider it when his PET scan lit up to the glucose that maybe he should be reducing sugar to stop the activity of his cancer cells. Instead, and it was discovered very late and it was extensive. So we're not questioning the fact that he had to have surgery and radiotherapy and chemotherapy to try to control this cancer in 2000. By 2004, he had to have more surgery, and he was on chemotherapy for over 11 and a half years. So in 2011, they'd said, there's really nothing more that we can do except more surgery. And Gary thought, this is just bizarre. I'm a doctor and I got this issue. I mean, he'd become pre-diabetic. He'd had high blood pressure. He had gastrointestinal reflux. So all of these things, and it could have been a combination of the medications and the side effects of the chemo and a whole lot of other things. But in 2011, he turned to Dr. Google he said, I've got to work this out myself because it's just not possible in the current healthcare system that I am stuck in, as well as trying to look after my patients. So he came across people like Colin Champ and Dominic D'Agostino in the US, who were looking into sugar and cancer and the correlation and potentially the side effects of too much sugar. And if you look back at our Australian dietary guidelines, which very much mirrored UK and the US, the dietary guidelines in the 1990s was to base your diet on 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrates per day. And back then, that 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrates was 2 slices of bread per serve, not 1 as they stated it is now. So you have to go back and you really got to look at the wording because they keep trying to minimize. No, we never said have 22 slices of bread as a healthy diet, but they did. So my husband, and you wonder whether the chemo even drove that desire, or the cancer drove a desire for even more carbohydrates and sugary things. Like he really did base his meals on carbohydrates. And then, so when he found out about potentially sugar correlating to cancer, he was also came across a book here in Australia called Sweet Poison, written by a lawyer, David Gillespie. And he thought, well, what does a lawyer know about sugar that I don't know about? Because I'm a doctor. And also our chemist at the time, she was a very holistic person. And she said, maybe you should be looking into a drug called metformin, which they use for diabetes. And they're finding that a side effect for people who've got cancer and diabetes is that their cancer is reducing. It's becoming less active, maybe going even into remission through the use of metformin. So in very basic terms, metformin takes the glucose out of your bloodstream and pushes it into the tissues. So it's probably not a great thing because now you're getting tissues that are filled with sugar, but on your blood glucose results, and for cancer that's not getting that glucose coming through the bloodstream, it does appear to improve those health outcomes in the short term, especially. And so Gary, just all this talk about sugar, and he just went, you know what? I'm giving up sugar. And it was incredible. But because of his medical education, he didn't even think about the fact that sugar, once you ingest starchy carbohydrates, they become glucose the minute you ingest them. And he'd forgotten that. And I reckon it took him about 3 months to suddenly start to say, wait a minute, I'm still eating bread and I'm still eating pasta and rice. And my blood glucose still isn't as good as I'd like it to be. It certainly got so much improved from the sugar. So yes, as you said, he just went, oh my goodness, he reversed his type 2 diabetes, he reversed his high blood pressure, lost a lot of weight, just became the healthiest version of himself that he could be, knowing he still had a cancer that couldn't go. But he put that into remission purely through his diet. It might not have been possible right at the very beginning when it was very active and, it was uncovered. But as time went on, it became an adjunct to his chemotherapy. And then he was able to put it into remission purely through his food for 6 years. And to him, it gave him his life back because he wasn't having the chemotherapy and all the side effects of chemotherapy. He has had to have further surgery because he has a very extensive tumor. And but they did a whole lot of tests and they said, still, your diet is controlling it so much better than any chemo. They did, they put the injection of the chemo through his blood and they couldn't control it in the same way. So his diet is controlling his health. And he is, so joyful for that, to be able to eat whole foods, unprocessed foods, certainly no ultra-processed foods in his diet. And he bases it on vegetables and meats and animal proteins and animal fats. And he is just thriving. So as you say, when in about 2012, he started considering reducing sugar for his patients because he was seeing so many people with the complications, especially type 2 diabetes complications, but certainly type 1 as well. And understanding that by reducing that sugar, he could reduce the complications in these people and possibly even prevent them. And so I say to him, I say even now, it brought joy back to medicine. Like instead of just being overwhelmed by the tsunami of metabolic disease and things that were out of his control, he was just cutting off, band-aiding, just fixing things, but to see people actually take back control of their health, to see them improve and not require surgery was really exciting for him. And so he went to the dietetics department at the hospital where he was working, because he came to understand that the diabetes menu included 3 desserts per day. So when did we go from a low carb management of diabetes, which was the original management of type 2 and type 1 diabetes, to suddenly saying, we can't do this. We've got to let people eat what they want, and we'll just keep giving them more insulin. But this results in complications. And you might be able to maintain blood glucose at a reasonable level, but it's not going to stop the complications coming. You need to really get that blood glucose level down to a normal so that you can avoid those. Richard Bernstein, as you would well know, he's in his 80s now, and he was developing complications when he was in his 20s, and understood then as an engineer, wait a minute, this isn't making sense. Why am I eating carbs and taking bolus insulin, not the basal, but the bolus for this? So he's now in his 80s with no complications of type 1 diabetes. So it can be done, but we didn't know about all of these things. Didn't know about the history. And I think that's the important thing, understanding there were so many people talking about these things throughout the last 100 years, but their voices have been silenced also.
Yes.
So I think that was a huge trigger point for Gary. But when he first worked it out, he was skipping. He just said, I'm going to tell everyone, do you know, type 2 diabetes is going to be eradicated within 12 months, 2 years at the most, he said to me. And then we found out, no, it was not going to be eradicated. So he was reported by a dietitian in his hospital for recommending to his patient with uncontrolled blood glucose levels that they reduce sugar in 2014. And at first, when he got the notification from the medical board, he thought, oh, this is a joke. They're not going to really follow this up. Okay, someone's reported me, but they're going to throw it out. Like, this makes no sense. No. So within the first 6 months or so of this, it was a Star Chamber investigation. I don't know if your followers, the people who are in your tribe, have heard about Tim Noakes, but Tim Noakes was also advocating low carbohydrate, healthy fat diets. And he was in South Africa. And their court cases, their investigations were going on at exactly the same time. And so over time, I've come to realize who the players are, and it was very coordinated attack, I believe. But at the time, so Tim Noakes's was a very public inquiry, where Gary's was all behind closed doors. In Australia, it's a Star Chamber. No one was allowed to know about it. We weren't allowed to have a lawyer. We weren't allowed to go to a court. It was all just done by this investigation, and there was so much pressure and always this fear that you would lose your medical license. You didn't know when they were going to take it away. Like, it was a very stressful process that Gary had to go through. And in the end of the 2.5 years that they kept investigating him, he pretty much provided them with a thesis on the benefits of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. He just kept sending them information, and he would highlight all of these things. So he pretty much did a PhD in that 2.5 years. And even at the end of it, the only question that the medical board asked, and in that one face-to-face meeting that he had with them, he was allowed to take his lawyer, but his lawyer had to sit behind him. So he couldn't give him any cues. He couldn't talk to him. He was just in the room. But at least Gary felt that if he was there, he would hear what was being said, and they could discuss it afterwards. It wouldn't just be Gary's memory of what the interrogation was. And the only question they asked him was, do you think that telling your patient to reduce sugar or eliminate sugar is specific medical advice? And Gary said, I couldn't lie. I said, yes. That was it. He was, the ability to talk about nutrition to his patients was taken away. He was the only medical doctor in the world silenced from talking about nutrition to his patients or the wider community for the rest of his life. And it was non-appealable in a court of law. It was unbelievable. And so during this process, I must admit, I started to develop cognitive dissonance and think back in 2014, the expert witness that the medical board brought in to determine if an orthopedic surgeon could talk about sugar to his patients. I thought he must work for the sugar industry. We have a very big sugar industry in Australia.
Yes.
And so it would make sense. He works for the sugar industry, this is why. So I did a deep dive. In my past life, as you mentioned, I was a nurse. So I did understand a lot of the concepts and the terms, and watching Gary and others at Low Carb Down Under, which is a big group of doctors and health professionals, allied health professionals who were talking about the benefits of low carb here. I'd watch them talk the science till they were blue in the face. And I thought, there's something else here, guys. No one is listening to the science. So what's stopping that? And honestly, before then, we had no idea. We hadn't even conceived that there were vested interests shaping guidelines, protecting guidelines, and that Gary was stepping on toes he didn't even know were there. So I did his deep dive and discovered that the expert witness didn't work for the sugar industry. He worked for the cereal industry. So it made total sense. It's like, oh my gosh, of course. So we sent this information, the screen grabs, the links and everything to the medical board in 2014, certainly early 2015. They sent it back and they said, we do not believe you. It's like, how can you not believe me? I have got the evidence. But because the expert witness did not admit it to the medical board, he had not declared it as a conflict of interest, and he denied it, then they didn't believe us. So I, as you say, then I went, you know what? I've been standing behind my husband watching all this happen. I didn't just stand beside him. I took a step in front. And for someone who's been very used to being in the background, it was a big thing. And I thought, I've got to use my voice to give him his back. So when they silenced Gary, he had a Facebook page with about 5,000 people following him at the time, which I'd encouraged him to get on and probably was the downfall. But it was called Gary Fettke, No Fructose, because again, he started out just talking about sugar. And so we put a big line through it, changed it to Belinda Fettke, No Fructose, made a big song and dance about it. And I started a website. And I don't think the medical board here ever expected, or even in Australia, had ever had anyone stand up and go, wait a minute, you're wrong. Because most people, when they're reported to a medical board for investigation, even if they haven't done anything wrong, the allegations are pretty nasty and could ruin your career anyway, just simply being reported. But Gary's was about sugar. So we went, you know what, let's just make a big deal about this. And that's what we did.
And I have to say, Gary was lucky to have you support him the way you did. I found out about you right from the beginning. I think when you first came on social media under your name, Belinda Fettke, I support Gary, the hashtag.
Yes.
Right from the early days, I've been following you and supporting you everywhere. So I've known you for a long time from a distance.
Thanks, no. And that's the thing. I did a hashtag, I support Gary. People were making little Facebook profiles with the hashtag I support Gary. Yeah. And the medical board had never had anything like it. And so we weren't allowed to challenge, as I said, in a court of law, but we could appeal to a national ombudsman here in Tasmania, or in Australia, sorry, not in Tasmania, in Australia. And the only way we could have Gary's ridiculous determination overturned was to appeal the process. So went back to all of the information that we found that they'd thrown out, that they hadn't listened to these things, that they'd made mistakes with different things, that they put out a press release. So there's a whole lot of things that are just beyond this conversation now. But we were able to get Gary's determination overturned after another 2 years of fighting for it. I support Gary, hashtag. So in 2018, the national board dropped all allegation and I say vexatious charges because they were all made up. And he had his name cleared and he even received a written apology. But in that time, I'd really become fascinated with the history. How did we get to a place where our dietary guidelines, if you look back in the 1930s, were meat-based and dairy, animal proteins and fats based, and now the US My Plate doesn't even mention the word meat. It's broken up into 4 parts and it says proteins. So as if the average person's going to know what a protein is. Belinda, Gary, yeah, sorry.
Let's go back. You uncovered. Did you uncover? Well, you uncovered many things, many
I did uncover many things.
Mysteries. But so who were the people who were trying to silence him? Apart from that one person you mentioned who worked for the cereal industry, was he just working single-handedly?
So very good point, because I do tend to run away with all things. Thanks, Nayiri, for pulling me back for a sec. I uncovered some documents from a group called the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum, the ABCMF. And this group was made up of Kellogg's, Nestle, Sanitarium, and a company in Australia called Freedom Foods. And they are the 4 biggest cereal companies in Australia, and obviously Kellogg's and Nestle worldwide.
Yes.
So they developed this group, and they were meeting once a month to, I suppose, chat about how they market foods and different hashtags and way they could engage the public to buy more cereal, consider cereal as the breakfast as the most important meal of the day, and all of those sort of research projects that then they'd put messages out to the public on the back of research that they'd funded. And I came across some documents that I don't even know how they got onto the internet, but they specifically targeted Gary. And this was in 2016 that I discovered these. So nearly 2 years after I found out the expert witness worked for Sanitarium, the cereal company here. And these documents stated that they had a partnership with the Dietitians Association of Australia. And this partnership was $23,000 a year. And Gary and I have often said, if we knew that, we would have done crowdfunding and gotten $50,000 for the Dietitians Association to give them different messaging. But for $23,000 a year, the Dietitians Association of Australia were to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal, grains, and, in brackets, even sugars messaging. So this is the problem, Nayiri, is that dietitians in Australia, and I think a lot of the dietetics associations worldwide, but in Australia in particular, it's not only their accrediting body, it's their regulatory body, and they provide the education.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're being given information to say that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, we have to have cereal, we have to have fiber, we have to have all of these things from the Dietitians Association of Australia, and by the way, if you don't do it, you'll be persecuted because they're the regulatory body. But I think when I spoke to some dietitians afterwards, they had no idea. They accepted that this information must be the right information because it's a professional association. And the scary thing is that here we've got 4 cereal companies, major players in the food industry, determining what our dietitians, validate and sanctify. So this group specifically targeted Gary, targeted Low Carb Down Under, that David Gillespie, who I spoke about earlier, but Gary was the only medical doctor named on that document. And so then their hashtag was love cereal for brekkie. So I said, I support Gary. When the cereal for brekkie came after my husband, the mama bear came out. And I'd already been looking specifically at the cereal industry because of this man who worked for them, and in particular Sanitarium, which was the company that he worked for. And as I did more and more research into it, in my head, I knew, because in Australia we've grown up with Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing Company, Sanitarium Health Food, Weet-Bix. Aussie kids are Weet-Bix kids. And, this is just, it seeps into your whole being. You don't even think about it. It's just part of life. Aussie kids are Weet-Bix kids. So I did know vaguely in the back of my mind that the Seventh-day Adventist Church owned this particular cereal company, this Sanitarium, but I had not really given any thought to it. So when I realized that the expert witness was working for Sanitarium, I just started researching more and more about them, started researching more and more about the other influences on our dietary guidelines. So as I say, I started to realize it was a plant-biased dietary guideline, and where did the meat go? So I've done a few different deep dives, and I've looked into the demonization of animal proteins and fats. I've looked into the minimization of the harms of sugar and gone specifically down this historical investigation into the roots of vegetarianism and where it's all come from. In fact, I've gone all the way back to the beginning of time.